You are? Yeah, Friends. Okay. Were you at Friends before? Okay. I knew you were a teacher.
Hey everybody. Thanks for coming today. Yes, hello. I'm Alex, and it's great to see you. We appreciate you coming to Flyleaf today, and your book sales and attendance are what let us keep having these events, so it's really good to see people in seats. This evening we have the honor of hearing from Matt Zemon about his book, Psychedelics for Everyone. Matt is a dedicated explorer of the inner world and a passionate advocate for the thoughtful and responsible use of psychedelics. With a Master's of Science in Psychology and Neuroscience of Mental Health with honors from King's College London, Matt has studied the effects of psychedelics on the mind and the potential for these experiences to serve as a catalyst for positive transformations. Thank you again, and remember you can grab a copy of Psychedelics for Everyone up front if you have not already. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt.
Hello, everybody. It's exciting to be in the hometown and doing this. This is fun. Thank you all for coming out. I think what we'll do is a couple things. I'll start off with some, I'll tell you a little bit about how the book came to be, a few stories, and then I'd love to make this as interactive as you want to go and as you're comfortable going. And it's, yeah, we can see where this goes from there. Does that work? Sure. Okay. So I'll start with the story, then I'll back up. There's the book starts with 4 pretty personal stories, and then it moves into kind of an overview of psychedelics as a whole. And then it moves into kind of medicine by medicine or molecule by molecule, and we can talk about why I call it medicine here in a minute. And so the things that people most commonly find. So for a lot of people, they will read the beginning and then pick and choose different compounds based on what they're interested in. But I'll start with the story. So April 22nd, 1995, I was 22 when my mom died, and she was just 49. I had experienced death before, my grandmother, my great aunt, even my dad, but this wasn't the same. When my mom died, it felt like a piece of my heart was ripped out of me, and I could feel the emptiness. When we buried her, I wailed. I didn't know what it meant to wail before that day, but that day I unleashed a primal scream into the world. I cried so hard, I couldn't breathe, and I sobbed impossibly large tears. That day I wailed, and I discovered what the low end of my emotional range was. That day I lost any faith I had in God, and then life moved on as it does. I worked and I missed my mom. I got married and I missed my mom. I had kids and I missed my mom. I put this part of me into a drawer and just went on with the living as the living do. And life was fine. But 24 years later, I would reconnect with my mom through a guided psilocybin experience. April 25th, 2019. I went into my psychedelic mushroom journey with no real expectations. I was never a drug person. I had tried pot several times and decided it wasn't for me. I didn't even drink that much. In retrospect, I clearly had control issues, and I felt more comfortable when I maintained the perception of being in control. Some good friends suggested that I try a guided psilocybin experience. I didn't even know what psilocybin was or why I would want to try it. They talked about how much people learned through these experiences, and I liked learning, and they talked about it being like going on a trip in your mind, and I liked to travel, so I agreed and surrendered to the opportunity. Our guide told us we would be safe. He prepared us for the potential of a challenging experience and said that if that happened, to ask whatever was causing fear or anxiety what it wanted to teach us. He asked us to bring something important from our childhood to the ceremony, and I brought the letter that my mom wrote to me while she was pregnant, and that's in the book as well. He built an altar. We brought up our mementos. We meditated. We ate the mushrooms. We meditated some more, and then I was gone. I had melted into the ground and was watching and feeling the world breathe. In waves, I became aware of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and all of the people that I was connected to in this world. I felt connected to the earth, the trees, and the sky in a way that I had never felt before. And I felt loved, unconditionally loved, and I realized I was safe. And I realized I didn't even remember what it felt like to truly feel loved and safe ever. And I realized that because I didn't remember what it felt like to truly feel loved, I hadn't been able to truly share love, not with my wife, not with my kids, with my sister, with my friends, with the world. I'd been living my life scared, and I was scared of dying. And then I saw my mom, and I felt her, and I instantly understood that she wasn't gone. She was a part of me, and I was carrying her essence forward. I could pull a string from her to me, and then through me to the kids, and we were all connected, and we were all carrying each other. And I felt this in my heart. And I viscerally felt that I was connected to her, and that we were united, that we had always been united and would always be united. The hole in my heart was for the first time in 24 years full. And in that instant, I realized that my perception of God was wrong. I could see a world that was bigger than anything I'd ever conceived. I could feel a connectedness that spanned time and space. I could understand in my soul that we were all part of something bigger. I could understand the truth that we are all brothers and sisters. And I remembered joy, true joy. And I was no longer scared, and I was no longer afraid of dying. And I knew that I was loved, and I knew that I was safe, and always had been, and always will be. That experience was just remarkable. I was talking to someone earlier. Within weeks of that experience, I got someone else to run my business. Within a year, I was back in school to get my master's in psychology and neuroscience, and was hyper-focused on the medical aspects, trying to understand how this is being used in the mental health space. I also was traveling around trying different medicines, from MDs, PhDs, Taitas, indigenous leaders, trying to see how those medicines made me feel and what they brought up. And I was surprised over and over and over again of how much I wasn't aware of, and how I'd been living my life asleep in so many ways. We set different intentions before each psychedelic journey, but sometimes the medicine has other things that it wants to show you. I'm going to read a second story that is one of those stories that is about, it was not the intention, but it is what the medicine gave me. And this is, I'll read this right. So when I was going through puberty, I had inappropriate, intimate contact with an extended family member who was more than a decade older than me. The physical contact had started a few years before and progressed. The last time it happened, I remember snapping into an awareness of how wrong the situation was and being mortified. The experience went from feeling good to feeling awful in a flash. For years, I felt guilt. If I was honest with myself, I had liked the feeling of touching her. I'd enjoyed the feeling of being touched. I felt that this situation was my fault, that my raging hormones drove this, and that I should have known better. Over time, I learned to understand that the adult is the one that is responsible for establishing and maintaining boundaries, that my physiological responses were normal, and that the requests made of me were simply not appropriate. But I didn't know that then, and that knowledge did not take away the feelings associated with the experience. Eventually, I disconnected contact with her and cut her out of my life, and that felt good and empowering. But while those actions removed the reminder, they didn't heal anything. My attempt to compartmentalize this part of my life left me with a festering, opened wound, a wound that leaked shame, a wound that oozed guilt. And this was a part of my life that I couldn't talk to anyone about. I moved forward and pretended it didn't happen, but it did happen, and I knew it did. And while for the most part I didn't think about her or it, every now and then I would be reminded, and I would feel my ears getting red, and a pit in my stomach would come back as my body reminded me of my childhood trauma. It had been more than 25 years since I had last seen her when she came to me during a psychedelic experience. To be clear, this was not something related to the intention I had set for this journey, nor was it something I had asked to be healed from. After all this time, it was an unexpected shock to find myself looking at her again, watching the experiences unfold in front of me like I was an observer in someone else's life. Watching this iteration, there was no shame or guilt. This time, when I looked at her, I saw something different than the misguided perpetrator that I had constructed. This time, I saw her as sad, lonely, helpless, scared. Without condoning or forgiving her actions, I could see her as a human being that was hurt, who had been effectively abandoned by her father, who was not as pretty or smart or talented as her sibling, a human who was having a hard time moderating her drug and alcohol use, a human who was looking anywhere and everywhere for love and not finding it. Without condoning or forgiving her actions, I had genuine empathy for her. And with genuine empathy firmly established, I felt my wounds closed. And at this moment, the psychedelic medicine allowed me to disassociate from myself, relook at an experience that had haunted me for years, and release the anger, the embarrassment, the guilt, and shame that had weighed me down for decades without even realizing it. People come to psychedelics for a number of different reasons. I talk about this a lot. Some people come from the medical model. They want more of a clinical experience. They want a doctor to prescribe something. They want to have a diagnosis. They're looking for a cure for a thing. And that's beautiful and that's important. Ketamine is our only legal psychedelic in America, is I talk about in great detail in this book and some of the studies. MDMA is a heart-opening medicine, and we should have that re-legalized in America in the next year, maybe the beginning of next year. Quick side note on that. They've been doing research with treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. So think about veterans, first responders, victims of sexual assault, people where nothing has worked, none of the existing pharmacological solutions or talk therapies. And in the phase 3 clinical trials, they have given people therapy, 3 sessions of MDMA, and some more therapy. And 67% no longer qualify as having PTSD. And 88% have had a clinically significant improvement in their symptoms. So the numbers are tremendous. So in the world of medicine, we can understand why we need to have access to this medicine. Psilocybin, similar results are being shown with people with terminal cancer diagnoses. And go on and on. So the medical path is important, and I think that should be honored. Then we have the second way people come to these medicines, which is the decriminalization path. People who say, I'm an adult, and no one should tell an adult what they should put in their bodies that grows in nature. Shouldn't make nature illegal. Okay, I get that. We're a Puritan society, so people saying they want to do something for fun has its challenges in our culture, but okay, that's a second path to medicine. Third path is the religious path. People saying, hey, for thousands of years, we have used this medicine for spiritual connection, to connect to a higher power, whatever that higher power is to the person or the group. And we are a country founded on religious freedom, and we have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So we should be able to practice our sincere religious belief and have access to some psychedelics through that modality. I get that. I think it's all an and. I think it all can work together. That we don't need to say, oh, well, if you have intention, you can do this, or if you have a diagnosis, you can do this. And this book dives into all of that. And it talks about cave paintings in Africa with mushroom shamans who have mushrooms going all the way up and down their bodies, and they're carrying a bunch of mushrooms. And it talks about the shaman in Siberia practicing with psilocybin. And it talks about people in Central America and South America and the witches that were effectively burned because they were practicing this. So there's lots of lineage for psychedelic history for all of us. It's not just the indigenous people or the Native Americans that have a psychedelic history. So part of this book is giving that information as well for perspective on when you're having conversations. But certainly, going back to the medical, depression, anxiety, OCD, eating disorders, substance use challenges, behavioral challenges, all of that is being addressed with different studies. And there's 309 academic institutions right now studying psychedelics. So research is coming out constantly on this. Quick disclaimer, word of caution. I call the book Psychedelics for Everyone because I believe that they're good for society, but not everybody is in a place where they should take a psychedelic. So I want to be super clear on that. There are people who are taking certain prescription medicines. There are people who have personal or family history. People are taking different supplements where you have to be careful. And in this book, I've tried to spell out some of those danger places where you're taking this and don't take that. And also where you can find resources. So someone else I was talking to earlier, we were talking about spiritpharmacist.com, a guy named Dr. Ben Malcolm. He is a specialist in this field. He does consults all over the country with people who are, I would like to take blank, and this is my medical history. Is this safe? Is this not safe? And maybe the better term is, are the risks reduced, or are the risks too great to make it worth trying this particular medicine? I'll stick on risks for just a moment, and then I'll read another story. When we talk about risk reduction, all drugs have a danger, right? We know that you can overdose on aspirin, Tylenol. There's a danger. There's a really cool study by a guy named Dr. David Nutt out of Imperial College London, where he said, let's forget how drugs are classified, and let's just look at harm to self and harm to others, and reorganize this chart. So when you look at his chart, on the far left-hand side, the number one most dangerous drug for harm to self and harm to others, alcohol. It's like a 72 or 73 on his scale. Big number. Come all the way down, drug. Bottom right are mushrooms, it's a 6. LSD is a 7, MDMA is like a 9. So all of these drugs carry risks, but relatively, some of these drugs are less risky than others. We talk about ketamine quite a lot because it's against the only thing legal. Ketamine is something you can take while you're on an antidepressant, which is different than many of the others. It's also one that has some addiction potential. Not typically in the medical, but it is. One of the things this book talks about is how do you find a good ketamine provider if that's something you're interested in? What are the things to think about? Because not all providers are the same, and can be legal. So there is a group of providers that are typically run by anesthesiologists. So they've been heavily trained in ketamine, and they believe it's a biochemical reaction. So you come into their clinics, and you sit down, you put out your arm, and they take your vitals, and they put an IV in you or give you a shot, and they give you a ketamine experience. Totally legal, and for many people, for some people, that's enough, just a biochemical reaction. There are others who say, no, it's a biochemical, psychosocial, spiritual process. So we need to help people prepare with intention setting as if they were taking some other type of medicine. We need to make sure they're comfortable, and it's more of a living room environment than a medical environment when they come in for this ketamine. We need to give them integration homework, because these things come up on these journeys when you're in the non-ordinary states that are different than how we think in our normal life. So how do you process that? So other clinics will give integration processes. There's nothing wrong necessarily with one versus the other, as long as we as the consumers know what we're getting. And if we don't know to ask the right questions or ask the questions we don't know. So someone else might say, all I need is the biochemical because I've got support here and I have support here. Beautiful. But asking those questions. And funny enough, those questions that you would ask a ketamine provider are the same questions that you would ask an underground psilocybin provider or an ayahuasca provider. So you can repurpose those based on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to dive into another story from the book. This one's on gaining empathy. My daughter is smart, she's funny, she's creative. My daughter is loving, she's generous, kind. My daughter is not neurotypical. I didn't even know what this was or meant. My wife and I knew that she was different. We just didn't have any context in which to understand her. When she was little, she devoured books and understood plot lines well beyond her years. We just assumed she was really smart. In middle school, her social differences became more apparent, and we started to understand that she didn't process social cues the same way we did. And then the panic attacks began. We would find her curled up in a ball on the stairs or in the hallway, inconsolably crying. We didn't know what to do. Between a gifted therapist and dialectical behavioral therapy or DBT training, she learned healthy ways to cope with stress and regulate emotions while becoming more successful in social situations. We learned the theory behind some of her processing differences and practical tactics for how to coexist and foster independence. And while I could understand the theory and loved her very much, I didn't feel like I could understand what she was experiencing or in any way relate to her way of living in the world, how that relate to what her way of living in the world felt like. During an ayahuasca ceremony, I found myself sitting next to her in an amusement park car as we entered some kind of carnival funhouse. And for the most part, everything in the funhouse was just a little off, a little creepy, a little scary. And every now and then we would turn a corner and something would happen that was very scary. And my heart rate would increase and I would feel like I wanted to scream. But then as quickly as the terrifying part happened, the ride would return to just a baseline level of discomfort. It was in the psychedelic-induced funhouse that, for the first time, I started to understand what it might feel like to experience a world that was different, the safe, optimistic, abundant one that I live in. To have an overwhelming desire to put on headphones to tune out sounds that are causing me agitation, to take a break from the creepy ride and get completely absorbed in the making of a piece of art, to decide to create my own worlds the way I want them to be through intense rounds of Dungeons and Dragons. My daughter is amazing. She has a gift of sight that allows her not just to see the characters she creates, but to truly see her friends. Psychedelic medicine empowered me to emotionally understand her in ways that years of theoretical training did not. It is again, every journey is different, even on the same medicine. Just because you've taken ayahuasca once, the second, the third, or psilocybin once, everyone is different. And the ability to feel these experiences versus anything anyone can tell you, for me, has been just life-changing. Interestingly, so I'm talking about the perspective of a parent looking at the non-neurotypical child. There's a subgroup that is now looking at autism with psychedelics. The University of Toronto is doing studies, and there's a weekly integration circle, and it's really cool to talk to these people in their early 20s and have them say, like, I couldn't read emotion until I found LSD, and then it cracked open like the world for me. Or another person was talking to saying, I have an incredibly flat affect, or I had an incredibly flat affect, and then LSD showed me that I needed to have my face and my eyes mirror my inside in a way that he just didn't know. So again, incredible things are happening with these substances in a whole range of communities. Covered a bunch of ground, hit some touch points. I really want to make this about, because it's so amazing that we are all here tonight in Chapel Hill, normalizing this conversation about something that is still very much illegal in this country. And the book talks about how it got that way. Talking about mental health, talking about spiritual connection, talking about ways that we've accessed, or the ways I guess I've accessed these medicines. And I want to open this for questions and make sure that I can address some of the things that you're thinking about while you're sitting here. So we can talk about any aspect of this book or anything when it comes to psychedelics. Open for questions. Yes.
So I've done psilocybin a few times, quite a few times. And I'm curious, just in your experience, how some of those experiences that you explained, having empathy, based on your childhood trauma, how have you carried some of that with you? Like, one of my second trip was a beautiful experience, and I was like a mother that I didn't have to myself. And I'm still trying to like maintain. What are some ways that you've found that you're able to, like coming back from a vacation and still keeping that like vacation glow? How do you keep the glow of your trip? Or how does it work?
I love that question. I love what you said about being a mother to yourself. I can feel that. That's beautiful. So for me, I approach these much more on the spiritual side than the medical side. And what I've been trying to do is create community and make sure that there's community after the experiences, as well as integration. So what that looks like for me is first, immediately following an experience, having kind of 4 weeks of set homework with weekly calls with a group of people who can understand what it feels like when you say, I felt like a mother to myself. What it looks like for me is having an integration coach, someone who is also familiar with this work, who I can sit down with and talk about, these are the things that are coming up for me. But then he can also challenge me and say, well, you said this. What's happening? Is that fading? Is that still important? How are you manifesting your life to keep that in that lens there? And then what that looks like for me is building a community of people and staying in touch with them that can have these types of conversations that don't look at you like you're, what do you mean? This is how it felt like. And we're finding that here and again in the triangle. So there is a church that I'm a part of that's based out of here. And we're having conversations. There's a Triangle Psychedelics Society, and I think they've had 3 or 4 meetings now. The last one was at the library last week, and had over 100 people show up talking about MDMA. And there's a test site here in North Carolina that's going to have 3 of the participants in this next study. 100 people, 45 at the one before that. So, yeah, find a community. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
So in hearing your story about connecting with your mother, do you, in your experience, does it feel like the medicine is allowing you to tap into sort of feelings that are already within you in a different way, or do you feel like you're actually going into a different realm that's invisible right now?
I love that question. I think it's both. So what we talk about in our circles is that this medicine allows us to remember who we are, to remember that we are loved, to remember that we are safe, to remember that we are enough, and that we don't have to do anything to be worthy of those things. And that remembrance is powerful. And when we work in this space, we are accessing, and again, so I'm trying to be careful, balancing the woo and the information. In my experience, we are inviting in worlds that we don't normally get to experience, and that can look like a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I think it's both, and this is actually, I think, the challenge with psychedelics as a medicine. In the old days, there was no separation between the preacher and the doctor. It's one person. In Western medicine, we have separated those roles, and the doctor is pure science, and for the most part, and the preacher is spiritual realms, what happens after life. And I could understand if we were to say, well, psychedelics belongs in the spiritual only. That would be fair to argue. Well, wait a minute. No, they don't have enough knowledge, the latest knowledge about our brains and our bodies to keep us safe. Fair. But if we were to say conversely, it belongs in the hands of the doctors, it would also be fair to say, well, they don't have enough knowledge of the spiritual realms and what that world looks like. So I think we're entering a time where we need a reconciliation between the medical and the spiritual, where we need the spiritual side to adopt best practices over here, we need the medical side to adopt some ceremonial best practices, and in a perfect world, we could all operate in the open and all share the best knowledge and techniques to keep us safe and to keep us on our different paths. And that's, again, where I keep talking about Psychedelics for Everyone, the importance of this book, the importance of these conversations is to normalize this so that we can get to that type of point. So we're not having an underground market, which leads to all sorts of danger. We don't have only underground guides, nor do we have only clinical medical. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that this isn't for everybody. And can you give some examples of what you mean by that? Is it certain traumas or certain conditions that the speaker are in, or be helpful to understand what would be contraindicated?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is that anyone who is reputable is going to do a medical intake from you. And the goal of anyone doing a medical intake is not to say no to you. It's just to make sure you're safe. It's to make sure that they're not giving you a medicine that's going to have a reaction with something else you're taking, and to make sure the format on which you are going to experience this medicine is a reasonable format for you. So for instance, in ceremonial space, in the ones that I participate in, there's typically 20-ish people in the space, and it's like a half circle, and everybody's there. So if, I don't know, if we were to make up a depression scale of 1 to 10, if you're up to an 8, sure, that's probably a good experience for you. But if you are actively suicidal, if you have severe depression, that's probably not the right place for you to experience the non-ordinary state of consciousness. There are a number of antidepressants that can have dangerous reactions with DMT as an example, or ayahuasca, picking one. Ibogaine. So Ibogaine is, if you have a family member who's having an opioid challenge, heroin or others, Ibogaine is one of the few things that really work. But it's one of the most dangerous psychedelics that we have. So how you take that and where you take that is something to have a lot of caution around. There are some over-the-counter supplements that can have reactions. MDMA and certain antidepressants can have challenges. MDMA and psilocybin, it's not so much the challenge, but for 50% of the population that can take antidepressant and psilocybin, normal dose, it works. And then the next piece of the population can take it, but needs a little bit more psilocybin for it to work. But then there's a piece that it just doesn't work. So where that gets tricky is things like MDMA, where you're having a blocker, you think it's not working, you take more than you should, and then all of a sudden you raise your blood level to a dangerous point. Untreated high blood pressure, pretty consistently, is a no-no with psychedelics. A lot of these things raise your blood pressure for at least part of the experience. And then I have a whole interaction chart and a couple other things in this book. And then again, I'm going to keep endorsing spiritpharmacist.com. If you're looking for really detailed information about yourself, sign up for a consult with him, and he'll look at your medical records and say, and it is a completely open conversation. You can call him, I'm thinking about doing this. And he'll say, well, based on this, that's not the best idea, or it's a great idea. So he's a good resource for you. And that's in the book as well, spiritpharmacist.com.
Matt, could you say something about shadow work? And I'm looking at psychedelics as an accelerant to waking up in a time when our society seems to be imploding, and psychedelics offer us this opportunity to wake up to who we are, and at the same time, it offers us the opportunity to deal with the shadow. If you could understand what I'm saying and say something about that.
So a couple of things that resonate with me. When we talk about this time of being that we're all here experiencing, I think this is probably the greatest time in the history of the world to be alive. There can be all sorts of challenges and all sorts of things that we don't like or we want to shift. And things are happening. Things are happening in a big way, and we're going through all sorts of changes. When we talk about waking up, that can to some people mean they have seen a higher power, they have had an enlightened experience. Oftentimes, it's just described as a heightened sense of awareness. that you are able to live your life and aware that the reality is amazing, is beautiful, and can still have challenges, and that we're living in this beautiful experience, and we have things that our energy is drawn to want to fix. When we think about shadow work, we think about there's the things we know that we need to work on, and the things we don't know we need to work on that can be from a variety of things. So I can talk about very specific trauma that I know I had as a child, but I might not understand how challenging of the birth process was for me. I might not know how something, I might have buried something so deeply that I'm not bringing it up to work on it. And what's interesting about psychedelics versus traditional therapy is in a single 6-hour session. The medicine might say, this is what you get to work on, this is what you get to look at. And I talked about in the story about removing shame, blame, and guilt. Many of these medicines, because they remove those constructs, it allows you to look at whatever you're looking at in a new way and with a new lens, which then can allow you to heal these things that have happened in your past in a way that's different. Removing shame, blame, and guilt, feeling anxiety, shift, not having the reaction, not having the defensive reaction, not having the scared reaction, not having the flight reaction, and just being able to sit with the discomfort of whatever it is that you are approaching in that shadow work can be and just incredibly freeing and incredibly powerful. On a side note, MDMA for couples, so back before it was made illegal in '86, heavily used in couples workshops. Because again, if both people remove shame, blame, and guilt and have conversations, you can say to one, when you do this, it makes me feel like that. And rather than the response of, oh, well, you don't understand, I need to explain why you're wrong, you can hear that in a way that's different. And then you can process it, and then you can truly, not so much apologize, but say, I hear you, and I see that, and I can change that. And that's super powerful. That type of medicine for couples is incredibly powerful. Going back, did I answer enough about the shadow work though, to where you're going, or did you have another direction you wanted to take that with that question?
I can come back to that. I have a thought, not right now.
Okay. Come back. Yes.
Do you have a favorite psychedelic, and do you have a psychedelic that you think is a better fit for a religious, spiritual experience?
Do I have a favorite? I think different medicines are for different purposes and different seasons and different things. When I answer it this way: when I help construct ceremonies, my favorite ceremony is a multi-day, multi-medicine. So like I love ayahuasca, where you do 3 nights of ayahuasca. I think that's powerful. But I like the multi-medicine, multi-day, because I think it takes people through I'll give an example. Day 1, using MDA or MDMA, one of the heart openers. So you feel a lot of love for yourself, you feel a lot of love for others, you can have some visuals, you can go deep, but for the most part, an MDMA or an MDA sassafras journey is a pleasant journey. And when you start a ceremony with that, everybody's heart opens up and you start feeling connected. And in that first evening after that first ceremony, the ability to share, say, well, I told you last night why I was here, but why I'm really here is because of this. So what's really coming up for me is that. It's a great way to start a ceremony. I then love moving to psilocybin the next day. So now you've practiced surrendering, you've practiced breathing, you've gotten to know your fellow travelers, you've gotten familiar with your facilitators. Psilocybin then lets you feel the interconnectedness of all things, lets you breathe into the earth. And you can go deeper on doing it back to back, in my experience, versus just doing it as a one-off. So I think that's a powerful second medicine. I then love going into Bufo, or 5-MeO-DMT. So my book, Paula, talked about this as the toad experience. It's a super short psychedelic, about a 10 to 20 minute experience, but it's a non-duality medicine. So while you might have an ego death with ayahuasca or psilocybin. When you do bufo, there's no you, there's no Chapel Hill, there's no time, there's just the universe. And it's really hard to talk about what that feels like, but from my experience, if this was the happiest I've ever been, it's close to the ceiling at that point. It's a radically different experience, and it's that in the industry or in this space, they talk about your personal conversation with God. There's very few people that come out of a bufo experience and who start as an atheist and end as an atheist. It's a really powerful medicine for ceremony. And then I liken ceremonies to anything non-psychedelic, like a hape ceremony or a tobacco ceremony of some sort, where people can just ground in and talk and share. And then, to your point, and then that's the catalyst. None of this, in my opinion, none of these psychedelics are a cure by itself. There's no bullet, there's no magic pill. It's a start, it's a catalyst, it's a glimpse into your inside, it's a remembrance of who you are. It's a look at the mountain so that you can then move forward and say, I know what it feels like to be my own mother. I'm not dependent on my mom for love anymore. I have it inside of me. And with that, it's then you carry that forward every day and it's a practice, and you carry it forward, and then you forget, and then you carry it forward, and then your wife reminds you, look, you're being an ass. But that's the practice, that's the idea. So I like that combination for ceremony. Yeah, I think that's for people who can do all three of those medicines, that's beautiful. But there are other people. The other thing I'll say about psychedelics is we have this notion of just sometimes you're called to different medicines. I was thinking about psychedelics, and ayahuasca kept appearing before me. Oh, maybe you should go to ayahuasca. I was thinking about psychedelics, but I'm on an SSRI, but I'm really thinking about psychedelics. Oh, maybe you should go do ketamine. I don't want to taper. Okay, don't taper. Start with where you're comfortable. Just different. They're different people and different times. Yes.
So what does doing a ceremony and then microdosing afterwards going forward? How is that, kind of keep it, feel, not the feel, but keep the wheels turning. Yeah,
Connection.
Connection.
So we're talking about microdosing. For those, just a quick, super high level, microdose is 1/10 to 1/20 of a regular dose. So it used to be, you'd say it's a sub-perceptual amount of medicine. So you can take it and you can drive, you can go to work, and you can parent, and do all the things you do. And mostly when we talk about microdosing, we're talking about either microdosing mushrooms or microdosing LSD. And mushrooms more often than not because they're just so easy to get. Many people, especially those who come in with a diagnosis mindset. There's nothing wrong with the diagnosis. They say, I have depression, I have anxiety, I'm experiencing depression, I'm experiencing anxiety. This has been an incredible experience, and I want some scaffolding as I move forward. For that type of person, a microdose is an incredible tool to carry that journey forward. Other people come to microdosing because they're looking to increase their creativity, increase their connectedness to turn the blues up, turn the grays down. Another good reason to find microdosing. I do have a guide to microdosing in this book. Just do a couple more things on this. There's two main protocols for microdosing. There's Dr. James Fadiman's protocol, where he says take it on day 1, still in your body on day 2, let it out on day 3, repeat on day 4. And every 4 weeks, wash it out. Paul Stamets, famous mycologist, says that's too complicated. Take it 3 or 4 days in a row. Don't take it for 3 days. Do that for 4 weeks. But I think, one other thing I'll say about microdosing, the research split. There is some research that says this is really amazing for connection, for depression, for anxiety. And there's other research that says it's a placebo. So I'll be straightforward. We don't know why it works. There's a lot of people who believe it does. In Silicon Valley, it's kind of all the rage. People are taking it. But we don't know on the research side for microdosing. There is some research coming out that's super cool. This goes back to the Paul Stamets guy that says, okay, take the microdosing, take the psilocybin, add a little lion's mane, and add a little niacin, and now you're not only going to do the interconnectedness and the creativity, you're gonna help with memory and dexterity. And he's got a patent coming out on that, and it's called the Stamets stack. And actually the specific amounts of niacin and lion's mane is in the book, but you can also
It's in
Google.
your book?
It is in there,
Okay.
yeah. But you can also Google it. It's a pretty common protocol for microdosing. And then I know somebody else here was talking about growing mushrooms. I'll just quickly, if you're gonna grow it, spores are legal to be bought, and grow kits are legal. And a lot of people here in the Triangle grow their own for microdosing. Many of them, what they will do is they will take a coffee grinder dedicated for this. They will grind up the coffee, and pro tip, don't just take the lid off after grinding. That becomes a fun day. And then give it an hour. And then they take those little pill makers, and in half an hour, you can make enough to microdose for 6 months or a year, easily. And then just a little jewelry scale, and tap it in to get your dose, and take your time finding. Dose practicing is better on a Saturday or Sunday, unless you're your own boss. And then once you find your dose, it's you know your strain, you know your dose, pretty easy to microdose. Any other questions tonight? Yeah.
You were saying you've constructed workshops, or that you've been to workshops that are constructed in the way you were saying, like multi-medicine. Do you have any that are local that you recommend, or do you have your favorites?
Yeah, if you email me, we can set up a time to talk after this. And that goes for anyone in the room. I'm here to share information. Anything, if I can help you on your journeys, I'm happy to help you. But there are a couple different, there's a number of different local options that run beautiful ceremonies here, that both here, Charlotte, Asheville, but certainly here in Chapel Hill.
Thank you.
Of course.
Your email's in the book.
It's super complicated. It's matt@mattzemon.com. So yeah, feel free to send an email, and then I'll send you a calendar invite. We'll set up a time to talk. Yes.
Quick question, and I wonder if this is just like a difference in labels or language or whatever, but like if you're in a sort of a psychotherapy, kind of space, I think the thinking is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't really get cured. You learn how to cope, with whatever the anxiety or experience or whatever. So like the second story you tell is really powerful, from that perspective, because that's years of work to learn how to cope. And the language you use here is really different, and it's, instead of not coping, but a cure. I wonder if you could talk about like what makes that possible in this space, or is it, just maybe a difference in language that we're thinking about?
And language here is super tricky. When we talk about cure, that implies that there was something broken to begin with, and that's again. It's tricky. There's lots of different opinions on this. When we talk about heal, we talk about become aware. We talk about remember, slightly different. So what I believe psychedelics can do is it can remove what you were associating with yourself and say, I'm not that. I can experience depression and not be depressed, or not embody depression. I can experience these different things and not identify it as who I am, just something I'm experiencing. So then what I believe can happen with this type of medicine is that you can have this remembrance, you can have these incredibly powerful feelings, and then you can enter a phase where, okay, I want to keep this going. And now I recognize I can separate the feelings from who I am at my core, which is beautiful and loving and enough. And then I can take that forward with the practice. But it's definitely not about for them. I don't believe it's about coping. That's not the terms I'd use for this. But I appreciate that question. I see where you're going with that.
Yeah, frankly, it sounds a lot better. Just open getting by, and the idea that there would be some sort of solution at core is, I think like most people who go into psychotherapy are kind of thinking they're going to get. That's not what it's designed to do.
it's a couple. I mean, we could spend a couple hours just on the challenges of the mental health care here in the country. I think many people come in who might need help on some type of level for some period of time, but our system's not constructed that way. We get you onto a different type of medicine that's meant for an episode or for a small period, and all of a sudden a decade's gone by, 2 decades have gone by, and these 10-minute wellness visits, you're being re-prescribed. There's a level of addiction that happens with these medicines that I don't think people really understand when they're given them, and there's a side effect profile that it's not clear. You just list a bunch of side effects. It's like, oh, itchy feet, not so bad. But they don't say like, oh, on this antidepressant, 73% you're gonna have a sexual dysfunction. Is that price tag worth it? Maybe, but they're big numbers. I don't think we don't have all the information to give truly informed consent in many cases. Again, just for the speed at which our healthcare operates. Thank you for that. I saw you had a question there.
Yeah, about strains of psilocybin, and how do you find out about it, and does it matter what strain?
Does it
you
matter?
get?
Yes, there's a huge amount of strains. Probably the most popular is Golden Teacher. Easy to find. It's a nice, easy. It's a solid, quality, consistent experience. You can ratchet it up. There's one called Penis Envy that is a little bit stronger. There's 900 flavors in between. It only matters if you are going from one to another. So whatever you found your way to start, if that works for you, that's beautiful. And then to be aware of, okay, I'm now somewhere else, potentially trying some other mushroom, just because I took 5 grams or 3 grams or 0.5 grams of this, doesn't mean this is going to react the same way. So just be aware when it comes to strains, and if you type in online, whatever strain you're considering, it'll tell you how relatively strong it is compared to what you had. That's an easy thing to find.
And are the names of the strains universal?
Pretty much, yeah. There's a bunch. The most common that you're going to find are pretty universal. And then a quick thing on mushrooms is just there's lots of ways to ingest mushrooms. You can obviously eat them, you can grind them up and take them in a pill, but then a lot of people like using some type of juice, whether it's lemon juice or orange juice, to let the breaking down the enzymes start in the glass versus in your stomach, and that keeps the nausea down. So that's another way to consume mushrooms. You can make it into a tea, throw it in with cacao or chocolate. It's another chocolate tea is a delicious way, and again, that keeps the nausea down. It's not that there's a lot of nausea with psilocybin, but for some people, it can be problematic. But not for most, but for some. Just like ketamine, we're talking 1 or 2% have nausea, but you can, with a anti-nausea medication, typically keep it down. Ayahuasca, on the other hand, you're looking for the purge. It's part of the process. Alex, are you doing okay on time? Okay, take 1 or 2 more questions. Yes.
If the trials are that effective and you're having veterans with suicide rates at ridiculous levels, how is this not fast-tracked into an effective treatment without necessarily knowing how it works?
We have so a number of things there. This is fast-track, but it's slow in the world that you and I live in. The FDA has given breakthrough therapy designation both to MDMA and psilocybin. Once they started opening up trials, things have moved relatively fast. One of the challenges, so not so much with the MDMA, but with other psychedelics, is that they're like psilocybin. There's not a lot of money in something that grows in nature. So who's funding that? Ketamine. Johnson & Johnson went and funded a nasal spray of S-ketamine and went through the process to get that to be the only one specifically approved for depression. While all the research says that regular ketamine, which is like $2 a dose versus $1,500, is as effective, if not more effective. But this one got approved because they went through the process. Which then brings us back to why the medical model and the decrim model and the religious model, I think, all need to work hand in hand. Washington, D.C. decriminalized a bunch. Ann Arbor, Michigan, Detroit, the entire state of Colorado, the entire state of Oregon. We can do something here.
Yeah.
This is why this conversation is so important. How do we get this for our brothers and sisters and people that we know and for ourselves, and how do we normalize this conversation? Because the results are staggering. So one more thing I'm gonna come to you, Colleen. Any of us who grew up from 1971 to today, we've lived our entire life in a prohibition that I didn't know we had. I knew we had an alcohol prohibition back in Never Never Land, but I didn't understand this, that, in this whole just say no, and that this is the frying pan, the eggs, and this is our minds. I believed it.
I did too.
I didn't know that, this is just the machine turning. This is just, the pharmaceuticals and how it relates to universities and how that relates to the press and how that relates to law enforcement. Fascinating book for anyone curious. Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Carl Hart. Another book I highly recommend, where he's been studying addiction for 20-some years up at Columbia, and came out and said, I'm a father, I'm a professor, I'm a husband, I'm a taxpayer, and I do a lot of drugs. And he went one step further and said, sometimes I do it just for fun. And super interesting book. But yeah, sorry, Colleen.
So I have a two-part question, which first is MAPS is pushing all this through the FDA for MDMA for the end of this year, hopefully. But where is psilocybin in the process? Do you know? 2 years out?
Another year or two beyond MDMA. Johns Hopkins research, particularly with terminal illness. So it doesn't change, just to be clear, it doesn't change the diagnosis. What it does is it changes the way that person experiences that final chapter.
Right.
And the way their family experiences that person. And then I'm a huge proponent of psychedelics for not just the person in the active state of dying, but for their family members. So that everybody can have perspective on what's happening, and to understand, at least in my woo-woo world, that we are human beings, we're spiritual creatures having a human existence. This is a longer time frame. We're gonna miss you, we're gonna miss the physical interaction, but you're not gone forever.
So now it's a three-part question. And your experience with ketamine and bringing that in, into a market, is your experience with that approval, the initial approval, then evolving pretty quickly to other conditions that can benefit from it? Or is it really strictly going to sort of stick with, in all probability, stick with the death and probably veteran PTSD? I imagine it's on the horizon too. I
believe that, like, for instance, on psilocybin, smoking cessation, the numbers are off the chart. Two or three times better than the best performing existing pharmacological solution. Alcohol reduction, off the charts.
Eating disorders,
phenomenal. So yes, it feels to me that this is so. Ketamine, sorry, just to be clear, is off-label prescribed. So the questions we have is, what are the guardrails the government's going to put on as it comes into this, and then how soon does that get loosened up, knowing that we have a whole industry that has a daily medicine that doesn't like this. We have a whole industry that wants more alcohol consumption and tobacco consumption. So there are forces on the other side, and that's okay. And again, decriminalization, religious freedom, medicalization, all working in harmony. Groups like cities that have the ability to influence political change. Ann Arbor, Michigan, decriminalizing. There's really no reason in a city like Chapel Hill that we can't.
So that's my third part of the question, is what can we do to help promote decriminalization in our community? And then, in our community first, because I think the rest of the state's gonna be a little more challenging, but is that possible?
It's totally possible.
Yeah.
Talking to your politicians, there's Reason for Hope is an organization that we could contact. There are some groups working in North Carolina. Charlotte Mecklenburg, the DA said you can arrest anybody you want, but we're not going to prosecute low-level drug crime anymore. So that's interesting. That's essentially saying, the DA's change. But talking to the politicians here and trying to make change happen, we can be hyper local. This is our home, and we can ripple out. We can ripple out the change we want to see in the world.
Have you been involved with any? I mean, do you know of any of
I
that
can,
going on
yeah, I
right
can
now?
connect you with some people who
Okay.
are working on those spaces. I'm taking a different path, but
Okay.
I'm certainly appreciative and supportive of what they're doing. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This was a great conversation. Again, like I said, email me. I can connect you with the Triangle Psychedelic Society if you want more of these conversations. I can talk to you about some of the religious things that are happening here. I truly appreciate you all coming out and supporting Flyleaf. Yes, sorry.
You could just say your email one more time.
Sure. It's matt@mattzemon.com. And yeah, thank you for normalizing this conversation. And I'll be around if additional questions.
I didn't.